This episode of the Let's Talk Yoga podcast is brought to you by my upcoming online 300-hour yoga teacher training. Over the past few months, so many of you have asked how you can teacher train with me. Well, now you can. Module 1 and Module 2 are online, and these are starting on April 2nd and May 21st. I can't wait to meet you in the training. And remember, these are small group online trainings because I don't believe in packing a lot of teachers into the room. Now, if you are keen to study some restorative yoga and pranayama, then just head over to ahamyoga.com, or just anywhere where you connect with us, you can find the links to the training. I can't wait to study with you. Take care. See you soon. Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 32 of the Let's Talk Yoga podcast. On the show today, I chat with Savira Gupta. I met Savira last summer via Instagram, and her insights and wisdom of the practice are always so spot on. And I noticed over months of having connected with her that I was resonating deeply with her message. So I invited her to join us on the podcast today. Savira comes from a family of strong women rooted in the Arya Samaj tradition who wanted to revive the Vedic way of life and the need to create a just society for all despite color, caste, or creed. She spent her childhood in Malaysia and then in India, and her teenage years in France, her adult years both between the UK and the US. She believes that this has given her the foundation to relate to people from all walks of life. She's a dedicated Yin Yoga teacher and teacher trainer. Her holistic and practical approach to teaching encompasses the understanding of the physical, mental, and spiritual journey through self-inquiry. She weaves a combination of personal anecdotes with stories of yoga mythology and scriptures from the Bhagavad Gita in her sessions and trainings. And I'm so excited that you get to listen to her today. In today's episode, we talk about the Purushartha system of yoga. Now, a lot of you may have not heard of the Purushartha system. These are 4 pillars of life. And Savira explains each of these pillars in her own experience and then relates them to the life of a yoga teacher. So before I let you go, please remember to rate, review, and subscribe to the Let's Talk Yoga podcast, especially if you enjoy these conversations on a weekly basis. I'll see you on the other side. Enjoy the show. Hi, my name is Arundhati, and you're listening to the Let's Talk Yoga podcast. I'm an ex-Bollywood dancer turned yoga and wellness educator. I've built a 6-figure business as an immigrant, woman of color yoga teacher with no business background, no handstands, pure instinct, and the free information found on Google. If you love doing yoga and you dream of teaching it someday, this podcast is for you. We go over everything from doing and teaching yoga to scaling a small business, living a modern yoga lifestyle, and so much more. You'll find interesting, fun, raw conversations along with some tips, tricks, strategies, and insights in this podcast. So grab your cup of chai and let's jump in. Hi, Savira. Welcome to the show.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. How are you? I know it's a little later in the evening for you.
It's about 6:40 in the evening, so it's winding down for me.
So you and I became Instagram friends last summer, but honestly, I don't know much about your yoga journey. Can you tell us a little bit about how yoga became such an integral part of your life?
I would say, so let me go back to my childhood. Growing up in Malaysia, my parents were members of the Gita ashram. And so I knew of the philosophy aspect of yoga, but never the practical or the asana aspect. And the asana came into my life very later on in my life at the age of 40 when I was having issues with knees. And a friend of mine in California was opening up a yoga studio, and so she wanted me to be her guinea pig. And so I she taught me for free, and I went, and one thing led to the other. And before I knew it, I saw major changes in my joints, in how my joints moved. And at that point, I really never looked at yoga as an internal practice. For me, it was at that point was more physical. But the response I got from people who knew me, especially family members, saw a change in me. And that's when I realized the power of yoga, how it changes your internal diagram or your internal history. So another teacher suggested I take a class, or actually a teacher training with White Lotus Foundation. But I think, like most teachers, I never wanted to become a teacher. But eventually that changed, and teaching became a very important part of my life.
What is it about teaching that is special for you? What made you cross over?
So I started out as a makeup artist.
Oh, okay.
And my father's a professor, my mother's a teacher. My brother is a professor, and my sister is in the same field but with the UN. So it sort of ran in the blood, and I started teaching Montessori to third grade in the US. So teaching somehow found its way, and it was in my system. And one thing led to the other, and I just started teaching. And the more I taught, the more I learned for myself, not so much what was happening on the outside, but that curiosity, that self-inquiry, that wanting to know more and to learn more and to share that wisdom became important.
Fascinating. They actually say, right, to teach is to learn twice. And I used to teach Bollywood dance. I don't know how much you know about my background, but I used to teach Bollywood dance for like 7 years before I started teaching yoga. And I remember before I actually got into teaching yoga or even doing yoga seriously, I knew one thing, that I wanted to continue to teach. And what I would continue to teach was something that I was trying to figure out. But you're right. When you know you enjoy and really want to teach, then it becomes a little easier.
It does, yeah. It's interesting. You did Bollywood dancing. I did Bharatnatyam.
Oh, okay. I don't have any classical training. My mother, I don't know, did like 16 years of Bharatnatyam, but somehow those genes just didn't download in me. So you've lived in the US and now you're living in the UK. Do you see a big difference or many similarities? Like, I think I'm curious, how is yoga in the UK different from yoga in the US?
Okay, so when I started my yoga career, it was in San Francisco. And I would go to studios and I never felt left out. That's it actually, which is very different to what is happening now. And as a teacher, when I started teaching, again, I had no do's and don'ts. It was teach what I knew, teach from my understanding and from my wisdom or my knowledge. Then my teaching moved me to India because I wanted to know more about I would say, the Eastern aspect of yoga, right? So more about understanding the spiritual self. And that took me to India. So I spent a few years there learning and understanding the philosophy and the wisdom behind it before I moved back to the UK. Now, in the UK, what I experienced was teachers were, or I would say the practice was also physically based. And there wasn't much, so I'm talking about 2015 is when I went back to the UK. There wasn't much South Asian teachers or Desi teachers. And if they were given slots that were not on par as your Western teachers. And there was a slight disconnect. It wasn't a harmonious. I never found it to be harmonious because teachers were coming in and out of the studios. And then I moved to Brussels. So I'm now living in Brussels and my teaching career is so different. Everything is on Zoom. But what I found here in Europe, especially in Brussels, that idea of decolonizing or that idea of changing is not there. It seems I don't feel it here.
Interesting.
I feel it strongly in the US and in the UK. So that to me was an eye opener. That was interesting.
Do you know other South Asian or Desi teachers where you live?
No,
You're the only
I
one?
moved here. I'm the only one. I mean, I only know this because I moved here last year when the
Oh,
pandemic
okay.
started. But there are about 2 or 3 Indian teachers who live outside of Brussels. So I do know of them. And again, we're all teaching on Zoom.
I find it really fascinating that you say that you never felt left out in when you were practicing in California. That's really interesting, and I'm glad you didn't feel like that. When I went to a yoga studio many years, not a yoga studio, I went to a few different yoga studios. I was always probably the only, South Asian in the room, but never really felt like, oh, this is where I want to come back to. So I'm really glad you had a positive experience.
I was lucky. I had a positive experience in 2 of the studios that I went to in the Bay Area. I never felt left out. I never felt singled out. And to me, I felt the practice of the teaching had more depth to it during my time than what is happening now, maybe.
Mm-hmm. And you said how you don't notice this decolonization movement so strongly. I spoke to somebody who used to live in Washington State. I'm in Seattle, so she used to live in Washington State, and she moved to New Zealand. And she was saying they are 10 years behind of what's happening in the yoga scene in Australia, New Zealand. And it was just, it's different depending on where you are located.
Yeah, I think what starts out in the US then slowly trickles down to the rest of the country or to the rest of the world. But in this case, both, I think, UK and US are pretty much on par with what's happening.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask you one more thing before we get into our main topic of Purusharthas. When you moved out of India and came back, how did your relationship with the practice of yoga evolve or change?
Interesting, because of the experiences I had been through in my life, my relationship with the yoga practice developed more on the stages of my life. And to understand why we Indians or Desis say yoga is a way of life, it goes back to the foundation of the Purusharthas. Now, during the Vedic times, these were our guidelines as to how we live, so that we live harmoniously with our family, with ourselves, with the world outside, with the environment. And this foundation I found in the West is missing when it comes to teaching yoga. And so when you take away the most important ingredient, it's very difficult then to bind the other ingredients together. And so what I've seen is now yoga moving in it's obviously asana based, but it's quite mixed up. So people really can't pinpoint as to where is the foundation, how do I grow that foundation, and how do I develop my foundation as I evolve as a human being through the different stages in my life, and yet still enjoy the pleasures of life, still enjoy the security of life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, can you elaborate a little bit on the Purushartha system? What are these 4 pillars or stages of life?
So Purush is being, and the arthas are the goals or the aims of a human life. And in Vedic culture and the Gita, we are encouraged to enjoy these different stages. Otherwise, we get left behind in terms of we lack a certain passion or a certain desire, is to fulfill our whole desires because we experience the world through our sensory organs. So Dharma is actually that tranquility and harmonious sensation of feeling that we have living in accordance with our inner consciousness and the outer consciousness. It has to do with our actions and our behaviors. And so dharma, you can say, is collective, and then we have swadharma, which is personal. And so that is being conscious of my own actions. Am I compassionate? Do I have understanding to others? Am I open? And when you have your dharma, it will always bring you back. So it's a gentle reminder. If you stray, it will call you back. And so this is dharma. So you're acting from a place of complete alignment with what you feel inside and in accordance to nature.
So powerful. What would be the dharma of a yoga teacher, Savira, according to you?
So from my perspective is, first of all, my purpose as a teacher and my key principles in teaching the practice and objectivity as a teacher. So when I am teaching the practice, I need to be in line with the understanding that I have learned, grown, searched through my self-inquiry about yoga. So a lot of teachers sometimes miss that. And so it's important to step on your mat and think, what is the purpose? Why am I here? Why am I on this mat? And who am I teaching to?
So powerful. Can we get into talking about the purpose of a yoga teacher? So many times, and you and I were chatting about this just before we hit record. We were talking about how yoga teachers confuse being passionate about something. And there's a huge difference between being passionate about something and it being your purpose. How can we kind of not be confused about passion versus purpose is what I'm trying to ask.
So also, not everybody can be a yoga teacher. It has to align with your nature, right? So there comes your gunas into play, depending on your sattva, your tamas, and your rajas guna. That also determines your nature. That will also determine whether you feel inclined to teach or whether you feel inclined to pursue something else. So as a teacher, my inner purpose at that point when I'm teaching this art is there honesty? Is it coming from a place of honesty? Is it sincere? And is my spiritual self also in line with what I am doing? And then we want to also notice, are we appropriating or appreciating the practice? So we have all these responsibilities that we need to look at. And it's important to put these in place as your dharma, as your purpose when you step on the mat to teach.
And also in modern, at least yoga here that I've noticed, is just because you do a yoga teacher training doesn't mean you have to teach. In fact, I feel like most people who go through teacher trainings, 90% of them probably shouldn't be teaching. There are only a few who will actually cross over and do right by yoga. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's totally okay to walk into a teacher training, explore it, study yoga. I'm hoping it's a good teacher training, and then never teach yoga ever. And that's fine. A lot of people think, oh, now I've done a training, hence I have to teach.
That's where then you'll start to question, is it really your dharma, your swadharma? Are you aligned? And will it benefit you? Will it help you? And will it help the collective consciousness or collective environment around you? So I always, when future students come to me and say, oh, I want to take a teacher training, I always ask them what the purpose is. Why do you want to do it? What is your reason behind it? Who do you want to help? Or who do you want to benefit? And these are soul-searching questions, just like any other job that we'll take. We need to ask ourselves, is it a fad? Is it temporary? Is it going to benefit me in any way? And if it does, how? And how will you benefit the people you teach?
So powerful. and so much to unpack. But I want to go back to something you mentioned about dharma a little earlier. You were talking about swadharma and our collective dharma. In the yoga world, the word dharma gets tossed around, according to me, pretty loosely. What are the dangers of something like this?
As you say, we can confuse a passion or a desire to teach as dharma. Passion and desire comes under kama, which is pleasure. So that passion and desire can move into addiction, and that addiction can become destructive, or it can also take you away from your actual purpose, your actual goal, what you're supposed to be doing. That's in line again with your nature. So I can say I want to become an actress, move into an acting position and fail miserably at it, but yet say, no, this is my passion, I want to do. And at that point, I need to draw a line and think, it's really not benefiting me, and it's definitely not benefiting the audience. So that's the time to step back. So people feel that when we look at it, and if we look at it from a negative perspective, then we're putting ourselves down. But it's not, because you've got to be honest. Teaching yoga has heavy consequences. It's an important tool that we have, and how we use it or abuse it can change the collective consciousness.
I like how you said, how we use it or we abuse it. That's really important for us to remember. Now, can we at this point move to the second pillar? And can you talk to us about what the second pillar is and how this relates to yoga teachers?
So our second pillar is artha, sustenance, right? So this is the basic human necessity and dignities. It's, in a way, look at it as your foundation. If you don't have a strong foundation, how are you going to pursue your dharma, right? So for yoga teachers, financial security is important. So yes, we need to look at the pay. We need to make sure that we earn enough in order to fulfill our dharma or fulfill our teaching. So right now, what's happening, and I've been in that state where I've just gone from class to class to class, eventually burnout happens. When there's burnout, then I don't have that drive, or I don't have that connection, or I'm not aligned with my teaching. And so who are the people who are going to suffer are my students. And at the same time, my own health is going to suffer. So physically, emotionally, and mentally, I'm going to be losing my foundation. So artha is what keeps you, I would say, sustenance, right? It is when you have this strong foundation, then can you be free to pursue certain pleasures, certain education. And without this, then you're stuck in constantly trying to find financial security.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I've always advised, yoga teachers I meet, especially the new ones, to not quit their day job while trying to slowly start teaching yoga. And yes, there are a lot of problems in the yoga world in terms of teachers not getting paid enough. I don't just think it's the yoga world, it's actually the whole fitness and wellness industry. And at least here in the US, it's a systemic issue, right, with minimum wages being so pathetically low. And oftentimes even studios have large overheads, and then studying yoga is an expensive experience. So it's just a vicious circle in so many ways. Now, what would you tell a teacher who is not making enough from teaching yoga, but is trying to get more into the yoga world?
Okay, so I would say at that point is, obviously you want to limit your classes, right? And the way we live right now is that everything is numbers. But at the same time, we have to take a step back and notice, is this really helping me, right? By gathering more classes, by focusing on the number of students, is it beneficial for me? And maybe I need to then at that point take a step back and find something else that will provide me that financial security. Because yoga, the practice of the teaching, you can always come back to it. But also, here's the thing, that as we transition from one stage of life to another, our dharma changes and our need or dependency on security also changes. So somebody who is much younger, in their 20s, for them at that point, maybe finance is not a big deal. So their purpose of teaching is to gather more experience. So they'll like to have many classes. But let's say you step back and somebody who's in their 40s, their purpose is different. Their way of teaching would be different. And so what they look to sustain them will be also different. So they may change their priority over there.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think a big part of this whole, I need to teach a lot of classes, I need to make a lot of money from yoga. I think it's because we've fundamentally confused what being a successful yoga teacher means. And we think that being successful is packed classes, millions of Instagram followers, and everybody just talking about us and Yoga Journal putting you on their cover. I think if that's a big problem, like a lot of people who graduate think the peak slot in a packed studio is their definition of success. But actually, end of the day, it's what you feel inward and your connection to your own practice and yourself. For me personally, defines what successful means. There's no point of losing your peace trying to become a yoga teacher and sustain as a yoga teacher.
Right, because if it's not going to help you, how are you going to then stay on track on your dharma, that purpose, right? So remember that when we teach, my actions is going to have a reaction. So if I'm teaching from a place of discontent, that is going to transcend into the students who will then take it into their lives. So therefore, it's important that at some point we have to draw the line and say, okay, I cannot do this. Because that brings honesty, that brings perspective. So to me, it's important that we need to look at the stage we are in our own life, in our own personal life. We need to look at whether we have the foundation that will support us, help us, guide us, before we can move or take a different direction in life.
I was just thinking of something that I had saved to ask you later, but I'm actually going to ask it right now because it's the perfect opportunity. What's your take on the age of a yoga teacher? Do you think there's a relationship between the age of a teacher and their spiritual maturity?
I think so. And I say that because, again, if you go back to our culture, we have 4 stages in life, right? But we tend to practice the first 3 stages. Now, remember brahmacharya, which is, I would say, the stage of anyone from, let's say, 12 to their early 20s, late 20s. They're seeking, they're curious, they want to know everything about life. So a teacher, if you're a teacher in that stage, then your style of teaching is going to be different. And you will be attracting those kind of students into your class, right? So what you're learning, what you're gaining spiritually or through wisdom is going to be very different. But when you move to your grihastha or the second stage, there's experience that comes with it, right? The way you've lived, what you've been through in life, what you've learned, how you've changed. So your spirituality, that spiritual self also changes. Your needs, your desire, the depth of your self-inquiry changes as well. So these are just guidelines. And I think the older we get, not only maturity sets in, but you tend to look at life differently. And, there's this saying, right? Some things you need to just put behind because they're not in your hands. And some things that are in your hand, you can work with. So yeah, I think it does. Spirituality, wisdom does grow as we age. And I'm not saying that it is the only thing. Some people can gain early spiritual wisdom and some people gain it much later on in life. But yeah, as we evolve in our practice, de- again, depending on the dedication and devotion to your practice, will that spiritual self change?
I'm glad I got you on that because I'm for everyone listening, right? You have to go to Savira's Instagram account because that's the easiest place to find her. And you have these little bits of life experience and you share so deeply. It's always amazing to me when you post something. I rarely read other people's yoga stuff online just because I'm trying to minimize my own time online. But I always read yours because I relate to it and I feel like it's perspective that you don't hear very easily in the yoga world. So I'm really, yeah, anyway, I was just singing your
I
praises.
was, oh, thank you. No, I was going to say that my father is a philosopher and my mom is practicality. So I have a combination of both. But the third aspect is that my background is Arya Samaj. So a lot of things, my grandmother, for example, would be doing all the havans. We never had a male pandit. She would do the havans for us. So that idea of empowering women, practicality, using philosophy, bringing it into your day-to-day lives, that is what I grew up with. And so I sort of, it gets reflected in my messages.
I'm glad. I'm glad we can benefit from your experience. And I'm going to bring us back to the second pillar that we were talking about. So, the first pillar is dharma. The second pillar is artha, which is sustenance. Now, before we move on, can I get your take on teaching yoga for free?
All right. I would say this is a personal choice. If you're offering one or two classes for free, then you can always balance that out with classes that are being paid for. I think when we offer anything for free, sometimes it can be misused and people then do not respect what you're doing or do not take the way you teach or your career or your position as a teacher seriously. So I think personal choice, you want to see if you're financially secure, if you have that support system, what classes are you willing to give for free that will benefit those who really need your classes, and what classes you would like to charge, because it is your job and you need to look after yourself and definitely receive payment for it.
I've also noticed that when it's an even exchange, and in this case, an even exchange might be people paying you for class, the students actually take the practice a little more seriously as opposed to it being free walk in. And I think there's an undertone of privilege in that conversation, right? When I have new teachers asking, should I, oh, I'm just going to offer for free because I'm so new and I have no experience. And I'm like, you can offer for free for people who really need it. But
Absolutely.
if you're teaching somebody who's got a 6 or a 7-figure salary coming in every year, then you're actually doing more harm to other yoga teachers who are trying to make their living from this. And it just damages yoga in the end because these seekers are not, I mean, these students, they're not taking it seriously. Your confidence as a teacher gets dinged because, they're not showing up. And then it's a vicious circle.
Yeah. That's why we need to come back to the artha. It is important because without artha, how can we pursue what we're doing? So definitely, as you had suggested, receive your payment. After all, it is your career. So why shouldn't you be paid like any other person who has a job?
I agree. I agree. So let's move to the third pillar, unless you want to stay in Artha for a little longer. Can you tell us what is the third pillar and how it relates to yoga teachers or practitioners?
So this is where passion comes in. Your desires, your pleasures come. And like I said, we experience our life through our five senses, our sensory organs. Now, if we overdo it in our teaching, then we've lost that joie de vivre, that passion that we enjoy teaching. And so we burn out for a teacher. The other thing that we can do is sometimes as a teacher, we're so dependent on teaching a certain style because of the response that students give us. So let's say if I'm constantly teaching an asana-based class, a vinyasa one, and the students like it, I feed into that. Their accolades, their compliments is something then I can get addicted to. So we need to watch that. And now for a student, you'd want to wonder why a student wants to go to the same teacher all the time. There becomes dependency. Why does a student practice only one style of yoga? Again, dependency. So this comes into your karma, into pleasure. Pleasure is and then also passion. Look at your passion, your desire to grow, your desire to know, to learn, to evolve. And also check in with our ego, because remember, sensory organs, are we feeding our spiritual self or are we feeding the big ego? Whether you're a teacher or whether you're a student. So yeah, this is a big one. As human beings, we tend to live in between these two, artha and kama, most of the time. And when we overdo it in these two, we lose our purpose.
Mm-hmm. Isn't there a layer of non-attachment also that is linked to karma? Because what I hear you're saying, and it's so true, right? You're overly attached to this teacher or to this practice or to the studio. One of my teachers in India would always say, everything in life is non-attachment. And if there's anything you attach to, it is the practice of yoga, but that is also when you have to be okay with it being taken away from you. So the teacher is the smallest part of that thing. Like, you never get attached to a teacher, because the teacher can move, the teacher can stop teaching, something else can happen to the teacher. So to me, it's just fascinating, because everything here in at least the Western world that I've experienced, it's heavily pleasure and convenience driven.
It is. And if I can add, teachers are very reluctant to share their students with other teachers. And this leads to strong attachments, and it leads to fear of losing. But you're not losing, you're gaining. On the contrary, you're gaining a lot. So yeah, I always recommend teachers to suggest other teachers for students to practice, because I cannot give everything to my student. There's some areas that other teachers are more apt, are more available to offer than I can. And this is what's missing in the West.
Very true. It's somehow become a I, me, myself, and my little yoga world, kind of each teacher in their own bubble. And I'm generalizing. And I know there are a lot who are not like that. But I also feel, Savita, like, you being a yoga teacher, you have to, yes, be very deeply rooted in your own dharma. And you will absolutely have obstacles in your teaching path. And if you are rooted in your dharma, you actually should be able to look at those as opportunities for growth. And a lot of times people are like, oh, but this is so hard and this is so hard. And I'm like, yeah, because that is real life. Anyway, I was just thinking obstacles and opportunities.
Well, when you see dharma, or the way it works is that you find your inner alignment with yourself first, right? So first it's me and myself. Then it's myself and my family. Then it's my family and my society. And then it's myself and environment. But if I just get stuck on me and myself, then where is growth? Where is the action going forward? How are you benefiting and helping the people around you? So by controlling and by living in between artha and kama, that constantly driving to gain, it's a vicious cycle, and we're never going to come off it.
It's also very, yeah, and it's that whole capitalistic society, right? We've got to learn how to apply these teachings to live in harmony with the society we're in.
Yeah.
At some level. Yeah. Yeah.
So for example, at my age, right, when I look at kama, the passion, the joy, the pleasures, very simple example, things that I used to do in my 20s, I no longer enjoy that. So it's over and done. It's finished. So you don't have that thing pulling you back all the time because you've experienced it. You fulfilled it. And so now it's time to move on to something different. And that's how we evolve and grow in our yoga practice, in our yoga teaching, to learn to understand that spiritual self, even that one step deeper.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And noticing when we catch ourselves falling short every time. So those are the three pillars, right, Savita? So we have dharma as the first one, artha as the second one, and kama as the third one. Can we get into the fourth and final one?
Oh, this is a big one.
I know, right? It's like a whole different podcast.
Moksha. But I'm just going to bring it back to simple again. How can we bring moksha into our day-to-day lives? I like to say, look at moksha as space that you've created, right? So you can start small in your life. If, let's say, you're addicted to sugar, how do you break that habit? Once you've broken that habit, you've created space that becomes moksha. So when we're teaching, start to notice how you can create openness to your students. What is it that you can share openly, listen, accept, understand? To be open to different viewpoints, to be open to the different bodies that you see, the different cultures, the different identities, to the different personalities that are in front of you. So to me, creating space is moksha. And, obviously, the more we study, the more we learn, the less ignorant we become. That is also moksha.
Mm-hmm. Can you just tell people what the word moksha means in case someone listening is hearing of moksha for the first time? Just the word, what it means.
Liberation. But again, depending on the context, it can mean freedom. It can mean space. It can mean, for an example, is that what is it that prevents you from growing, right? When you find what it is that prevents you from evolving, and when you break away from that, you've created moksha for yourself as well.
Mm-hmm. Would you say acceptance is also part of moksha in the simplest way?
Yes. Yeah. When you drop a thought, right? But here's the interesting thing. The minute we drop a thought, we fill it up with another thought. So before you fill it up, notice the gap or that space. That is also moksha. Notice the space between your in and out breath. There's a small pause. That is space. That is freedom, that tightness. So moksha can mean many things depending on the context. But broader sense, when we talk about liberation for others, you need to liberate yourself first, and you need to understand that before you can take it outside.
Absolutely. And moksha, I've always thought of moksha as such the traditional way of looking at moksha is a really big thing, for lack of a better word.
It's massive.
It is, right? And for somebody like me to talk at length about it, I'm not capable of that. But I can, in my little yoga understanding, I can find pieces of, that little moksha that you were talking about on day to day. For me, that's a pause. And that's a pause right after I finish teaching, just sitting on my mat for a couple of minutes. Or it could be in the morning, closing my eyes and finding that silence. Those pauses are my little moments of peace. I'm not saying that it's the same as moksha, but we've got to find ways of bringing that into our modern living. And what you said was very, very relevant.
I mean, we have to start small, right? And then the more we develop that or cultivate that space, that freedom, right? Then are we able to understand it on a broader level? But what I see happening is that we're trying to understand it from a broader level without actually learning the tools on a smaller level.
It's like you have to first teach yoga to yourself if you want to be a yoga teacher before you teach it to anybody else.
Right. It's like a child learning to walk without crawling. How does the child get? So there are stages that we need to go through. Plus, our maturity stage also changes as we evolve.
I really, in my head, the one thing I'm playing back is how you said when you drop a thought, notice the gap from one thought to the next. That's something that's going to stick with me for a very long time. I really enjoyed that. Savira, this has been so wonderful talking and connecting with you. Is there anything you want to say about the Purusharthas before we wrap up for today?
I would say use these Purusharthas as guidelines in your teaching and as you evolve as a person, because they're going to change. Your dharma may change, your artha will change, your kama and moksha will change. So the whole key is not to get too stuck on where you are in stage, let's say at the 20s, and hope to bring that into your 30s, because it will evolve. So being open is moksha to these different stages and evolvement of our spiritual self.
Wonderful. Can you tell our listeners where they can connect with you?
You can find me on Instagram or on my YouTube. I do offer yoga practices there. And if you want to connect with me, you can visit me on my website, which is saviragupta.com.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Savira. This has been awesome.
Thank you so much. I hope this makes sense.
It totally makes sense. And I can't wait for the listeners to get their hands on this. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Really appreciate that.
Thanks for tuning in. As always, please remember to follow us on Instagram at Arundhati Baitmangalkar and join our exclusive Facebook group called Let's Talk Yoga. I'll see you next week with a brand new show. Take care. Bye-bye.